Hi, everyone. Thanks for dialing in. We're really excited to bring this webinar to you today. We know that over 375 people registered for the webinar, so there's a lot of interest in the topic. I'm going to take care of a few housekeeping items before we get started. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted on our C2ES website. We have a lot of folks on the call, so if you're going to ask questions, please go ahead and use the GoToMeeting chat function, that chat box. You can submit your questions online, and I will raise them for our panelists. And hopefully you can see on your screen here the agenda. I'm going to start by saying a few words about C2ES, and then I'll introduce our panelists. They will help us go through the task force recommendations that came out this summer, and then I'll walk through our new C2ES publication on climate reporting, and then we'll have an interactive discussion session. So C2ES stands for the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. We are an independent nonprofit. We try to work in a bipartisan manner with both sides of the aisle. We have three goals that are here on your screen: reducing greenhouse gas emissions, expanding the deployment of clean energy, and boosting resilience to climate impacts. All of our publications are available for free on our website. One of the things that makes C2ES unique is that we have a Business Environmental Leadership Council, and it is made up of top companies in many sectors. And you can see on the slide here major companies from sectors like electric power, transportation, information technology, oil and gas, and finance. And this Business Council is one of the largest US-based groups of companies that are focused solely on climate change. And this council is invite only, and all of the companies agree on 4 principles. They accept the scientific consensus that climate change is occurring and that delaying action will increase the risks and costs of climate change. They believe that businesses should incorporate responses to climate change into their corporate strategies by creating greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets and investing in low and zero emission products and services. All of these companies believe that the U.S. should adopt economy-wide mandatory approaches to reducing emissions that should include market-based mechanisms, and they believe that climate change is a global challenge that requires an international climate framework for all nations. And we're very fortunate to have with us here today 2 leading experts in climate-related financial disclosures to help us guide through the recommendations and the new issue brief. And both Matt and Neil are from companies that are on our Business Environmental Leadership Council. So let me just briefly introduce them. Matt Arnold is a Managing Director and the Global Head of Sustainable Finance at JPMorgan Chase. He leads the company's client engagement efforts on sustainability across all sectors globally. Dr. Neil Hawkins is the Chief Sustainability Officer and Corporate Vice President for Environment, Health, and Safety at the Dow Chemical Company, and he led the development of the company's 2025 sustainability goals. So thank you both very much for being here today. And now we're going to go over the new task force recommendations. Both Matt and Neil were on the task force, and with that, I'd like to hand it over to Neil.
Well, good. I guess it's good afternoon to those of you who are in East Coast time. Thank you very much for having us today. Matt and I will tag team this presentation, and then we'll be open for questions at the end. So be thinking about your questions. First slide, please. Here is a list of the members of the task force. It was a very distinguished group. It represented virtually every type of financial institution that has a role to play in assessing and evaluating risks of all different types, helping to allocate capital, and helping to insure capital and investments. There were also a subset of members that are preparers. So there are financial members, and then there were preparers. I was a representative, Neil Hawkins here, I was a representative of a manufacturing and research company that was a preparer. Matt?
Thanks, Neil. Fatima, let's just go to the next slide. I think you did a great job there, Neil.
Okay. And again, we're tag teaming this whole thing, so sorry if it's a little choppy, and there is a 3-second delay in the changing of slides. So the G20 ministers, financial ministers, really had a vision to come up with a more consistent way to disclose climate-related risks for companies so that capital and investments could be allocated in a much more informed way. And that was the vision Mark Carney and Michael Bloomberg had in setting up this group. Really, before this group, there wasn't a specific set of consistent recommendations geared specifically at financial investments. And so really that was the task, was coming up with such a consistent kind of a core set of recommendations that eventually the hope would be most companies would adopt and make disclosures around. And this is not just for a few companies. We're talking about the myriad of global companies that are part of the investment picture worldwide. Matt?
Thanks, Neil. I'll just add, just to underscore that last point, it's essentially any company that wants to access public capital markets has got to consider its climate-related financial risk and disclose it to investors. This is not a new topic, as you all probably are aware. I'd say the banking industry has been thinking about its sort of financed emissions since the late 90s and have taken a couple of runs at trying to figure out accounting methodologies, facilitated sometimes by CDP or other NGOs. At the beginning of this, we met with the dozen or so NGOs that have disclosure frameworks of some kind that are relevant here. And so the content isn't new, but what's brand new is that for the first time, the world's financial regulators, or the G20's financial regulators, were the ones asking. And so from a banking perspective, that was a game changer, because it's not civil society calling anymore, it's a regulator. Next slide, Fatima.
So the task force recommendations came out middle of this year. They were presented to the financial ministers of the G20, and it dealt with all the areas that we've already talked about. But it just came out about 6 months ago or 4 months ago, and was well received, and we're moving more into an implementation phase. Matt?
Yeah, I don't have a lot more to add here. The financial sector, we're going to get into this in a minute. There were 4 subsets, and the kind of the ambition was that we would come up with a common disclosure framework that would allow comparability through time and across companies in the same industry and across companies in different industries. History will tell whether we got there, but we certainly made progress towards that. Go ahead, Fatima.
So this was a look at both the climate-related risks and climate-related opportunities. And I think that's important to keep in mind. You know, there are a set of risks that could be costs going up for energy, could be threats to business models and products, could be reputational risks, but there's a risk picture. But at the same time, there's a transition of a global economy and many local economies that will go on. And for some companies, especially those that have technical solutions or business models that will thrive in a lower carbon world, this is actually potentially a plus. So we definitely went into this thinking it's not just risk management, though risk management's a critical piece that needs to be assessed when doing these disclosures. Matt?
Next slide.
Okay. So the focus of this whole effort was on financial impact. Okay, it wasn't a debate about whether climate science is real, whether climate is changing. It wasn't a debate around public policy, how climate should be regulated per se. This was all about getting to a more consistent cross-company set of disclosures as to how companies are governing their risks, how they're strategizing to manage those risks, how they're managing the risks, and what metrics they're going to use moving forward. But it's really the focus is on financial here. And we did take into account all of the different inputs that you might imagine. And a key part of that whole debate period really led us to scenario planning as a key element of the recommendations. Matt?
Next slide, and Neil, I'll start on the next slide. So, as Neil said, the goal of the boundary, as it were, of the task force's debate was decision useful information for an investor. What does an investor need to know about a company and its forward-looking risk or opportunity relative to climate change? And we landed on the four buckets that you see on the screen, that these are the four areas that would need disclosure. How do you govern that risk? What is your strategy for managing or capitalizing on it, managing the downside and driving upside? What is your risk management process, and what metrics and targets do you have? So those four areas are where, and that's all sectors, all geographies. And again, it should be the financially relevant, decision useful to an investor. Go ahead, Neil, if you want to talk on that one.
I would just jump to the next slide. What you see here, and I don't know if you can read it, but these are available slides also. This just gives some additional flavor for what is involved in the governance pillar, what is involved in strategy, what is involved in risk management, and what is involved in metrics and targets. The task force spent a huge amount of time debating all of these, and for good reason. You know, we were trying to come up with a core set of recommendations that the financial regulators, the financial investing community could implement across virtually any company. So these are the core set of disclosures for any company. How are you deciding, making governance decisions around climate? What is your strategy dealing with climate? How are you managing risks related to climate? And then importantly, over time, how are you measuring the impact of climate, both risk side but also opportunity side? So if you're someone that has to implement new disclosures, this slide is pretty important in that it gives you the comprehensive set of thinking of the task force. Matt?
I'd just like to give you all a little color. You know, this slide represents a compromise between two differing worldviews, one that would have had asking 50 questions or putting 50 items in. There are 11 here, so it's 4 buckets broken out into 11 disclosures. The other extreme was a perspective that would have one question, which is how are you managing your climate-related risk? And so the whole process was actually quite healthy, but pretty robust debate over how rigorous, and sort of how penetrating. Next slide.
So what we were just describing is the all-sector guidance. In addition to that, there was supplemental guidance for 2 major categories: financial industries, banks, insurance, asset managers, asset owners, and then non-financial groups: energy, transportation, materials and buildings, and agriculture, food, and forest products. So there was additional guidance and work done in all of those different sectors. Matt?
I would just say, so what we did, JPMorgan Chase, is we took the 11 from the all sector plus the banks and asset managers and laid it out and just asked ourselves, is this, and we're now hard at work developing our own. I'm getting a little ahead of ourselves, but we just sort of laid this out as a table of contents for a report and are kind of moving ahead with it. Next slide.
Okay, so let's see, we're on principle. Okay. Did we miss one? Location of disclosure.
Yeah, we're back now.
Okay, all right. It doesn't really matter. We had a lot of debate about whether this should be in regulated disclosures or in other official company reports. And to the extent possible, this task force is encouraging reporting to be done in very consistent ways in financial disclosures. Okay, so as a principle, we want to see more of that. We want to see it more consistently done with comparability, enough information, but comparability across companies. There was recognition and a lot of debate about whether or not in some countries the regulators wouldn't want some of these disclosures done this way. So there was some balancing of local regulation versus international and global needs for information. But in general, the focus is very clearly on getting to financial filings where you can, and where you can't, work through other reports. Matt?
And I think this is still a work in progress, because companies, as they are doing their report, are going to assess the financial materiality of their climate-related financial risk, and if they conclude that their financial risk is not material to the results of the company for that year, there will be pushback, certainly in the U.S., around where the disclosure is. So I think the thought here is it's an aspirational goal. The real key is to get reporting, and the precise decision on location will have to depend on materiality.
Okay, next slide. So speaking of materiality, again, this was a big source of debate. But the task force believes governance and risk management recommendations should be provided to investors who want insight into how the company is working with these issues, really regardless of materiality. Where strategy, metrics, and targets are concerned, they're more needed and more necessary where you do have materiality assessed. Now, if a company wants to disclose all of these and their local regulators are supportive, go right ahead. But we do believe how you're governing climate change as a company at the board level and below, and how risks are being managed should be disclosed regardless of materiality. But then as you get deeper into this, you would definitely want to go into strategy, metrics, and targets. On scenarios, there was a lot of discussion around scenario planning and how to use that relative to assessment of strategy. We did a lot of work on a 2-degree scenario, and we landed that a 2-degree scenario needs to be considered as part of an assessment of climate risk, or as one scenario within a range of climate-related risks. So that's where the 2-degree scenario comes from, and we utilized information from authoritative international scientific and economic bodies in developing aspects of a scenario. But the whole report calls for using scenario analysis, a range of scenarios, but always including a 2-degree scenario. Matt?
So this, and I'll speak as a bank, not for the whole task force. And I think that the scenario analysis is most sort of designed for companies that have long-lived assets, physical assets. If you look at a bank, we're very heavily regulated in our stress testing and the scenario analyses that we do within the stress testing. And the stress testing horizon, as regulated by the Fed, is 9 quarters. So we have 2 years and a quarter. That's the stress testing horizon. Temperature is not going to evolve at that pace, and so the whole notion of scenario analysis is going to have to adapt to the business realities of each company that's reporting, and so we've concluded that a long-range temperature scenario will probably not work for us. We need nearer-term event-based scenarios. So, next slide.
And just one additional thing on scenarios. Don't change the slide. The 2-degree scenario isn't. Go back to the next slide. The 2-degree scenario is not just for assessing direct impacts, but it's also inherent in a set of assumptions about cost of carbon and whether or not there'll be value on carbon, and if so, what kind of values need to be assessed. So there are multiple things to think about with the 2-degree scenario. In addition, go to the next slide. In addition, depending on what kind of business you're in, actually assessing scenarios that are higher than 2 degrees could be very important. For example, if you're located on rising sea level, it may be very prudent to look at a 3 or 3.5 degree scenario and its impact on your holdings if you own land on the ocean. So this area of scenarios is pretty deep, and there's a lot of, it really comes down to each company figuring out, just as Matt said, what it means for them. Now, on implementation path, the key thing here is this is evolutionary, and that may be disappointing to some people, but the power of this set of recommendations is to move dozens and then hundreds and then thousands of companies towards consistent reporting, but it's going to take quite a bit of time, this is shown over a 5-year time frame, but we just released the report. We're going to try to get early movers into reporting very consistently with the recommendations, and then try to broaden that out over time and get to hundreds and then thousands of companies globally making reports along these lines. But it's going to take some time. Matt?
Yeah, I would just second that. What we've found is not only are companies in general in very different places, the task force members were in very different places in terms of what they're already disclosing, what their ambition is for disclosure, what their expectations are. And so our sense for ourselves and for our industry and for anyone who ever asks us is figure out what works for your business and get on the road. And there'll be a 1.0 and a 2.0. We've been at this for several months, and I'll tell you, it's really hard. It's hard to think about getting the numbers right and to, I mean, the narrative around governance and strategy, that's easy. What's hard is the quantitative part and figuring out something that's plausible within a time frame that's meaningful. And so my sense is that the early reports won't be perfect, but that there's a lot of institutional learning that will happen, and that just getting going is really, which is why this is a 5-year slide. And I think it's a recognition that this is a big institutional change. Next slide.
So what are some of the benefits of using the task force recommendations? I believe that it will become the standard approach for financial disclosures around climate. I think you're also seeing increased activity with board members trying to improve their knowledge of climate. So having a defined set of disclosures for most companies to follow, I believe, will make it easier for board members, investors, lenders, insurers, etc. I think it will also create a platform for management to work with their board. If many companies are working this way, it'll be easier than every single company coming up with its own framework for discussing with its board what they're up to. As financial requirements, reporting requirements go up with regulators, it'd be much easier to demonstrate that you are managing your disclosures in a responsible way. I do think it will help in risk management and company decision making. And I do think over time you'll have fewer inquiries for more information from different kinds of people as we follow a consistent approach. Matt?
I would just underscore all that, just add one, and this is again a personal observation. The process of pulling together our stress testing folks, our financial reporting folks, the climate teams, the business teams has been really, really eye-opening to everyone. And so there's an organizational learning and development part of this that I don't think I fully appreciated how strong that would be and how valuable it's becoming. Next slide.
Okay, I think this is our last slide. We're really early in this process. There's a lot of outreach and engagement going on right now between the task force and various organizations. A lot of outreach. Matt's done many of these sessions. I've done quite a few. And there are many that we're not involved in. But organizations like C2ES and Ceres and CDP and GRI and all of them, we really have to work together here to advance this ball. So early adopters, getting out there and then showing prototypes for how this can work for different kinds of companies. On the investor side, different companies utilizing the information, asking for it, I think it will build momentum. But we are in the early part of the curve, and whatever you can do to help with this, you know, we're very interested from the task force side, and also we're interested in seeing the prototypes that come along from other companies. Matt, last word?
You know, I don't think I have any last words. I'm looking forward to questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. That was a really good overview. It was really wonderful to have two members of the task force on our webinar to explain the recommendations. What we're going to do now is I'm going to briefly walk through our C2ES publication on this topic, and I see that a number of questions have been coming in. Keep them coming in. We'll turn to them in our discussion session. So what you see on your slide here is a screenshot of our new C2ES publication. It's called Beyond the Horizon, Corporate Reporting on Climate Change. It is available for free on our c2es.org website, and in the chat box it is attached as a handout. So I wanted to just tell you a little bit about the process to develop this issue brief. So C2ES has some prior experience working on business resilience. We previously published two issue briefs. One was from 2013. It was called Weathering the Storm, Building Business Resilience to Climate Change, and we did a follow-up report in 2015. So in those reports, we really worked with companies, interviewed them on their process to prepare for climate change. And building on that research, we interviewed several members of our BELC Council, that's the Business Environmental Leadership Council. And the task force, they had a phase 1 report, they had a draft report, and they allowed opportunities for public consultation. So we had some work groups on our business council, and we submitted a comment letter to the task force on the draft recommendations, and that is also available on our C2ES website. So based on the company interviews that we did, based on our previous research on business resilience, and based on our comment letter, we pulled together this issue brief. So we talked about this a little bit already, but in the issue brief, we outline what we see as the opportunities from improved climate reporting. And as Matt mentioned, we think that one of the greatest opportunities here is that there may be increased internal understanding and communication around climate-related issues as companies look at the task force recommendations and think about how to implement them. There may be development of new and better corporate governance practices. As Neil mentioned, maybe the relationship and communication between the management and board may be improved by going through this process of looking at these recommendations and thinking about communication on climate change. We also think that companies may be better positioned to take advantage of climate-related opportunities and prepare for risks, and that does build off of that first bullet point on communication. We do think that if companies are proactively addressing stakeholder and investor concerns about climate change, there may be reduced costs related to information requests and shareholder proposals, and that was something that was also mentioned earlier on this webinar. So just as a note, we did some research, and certainly it looks like investor pressure on climate change has been increasing. We looked at a 2015 survey, and we found that 2/3 of institutional investors reported that, in their opinion, companies are not adequately disclosing information about ESG risks. And ESG is a little bit broader than climate change. It stands for environmental, social, and governance. And just one data point as an example, State Street Global Advisors is an asset manager with about $2.4 trillion in assets under management. Earlier this year, in January of 2017, the CEO sent a letter to the boards of the companies State Street invests in and explained that State Street was going to focus on board oversight of sustainability issues, including climate change, because in their perspective, this would be material over the long term. And then finally, this kind of relates to what the FSB noted when it launched the task force. If there is more transparency, there's an opportunity for investors to focus on climate solutions. And this might actually facilitate a smoother transition to a lower carbon economy as investors have better information about whether companies are managing risks appropriately. So with those benefits in mind, we did want to highlight some of the current challenges related to climate reporting that we're hearing about from companies. And the idea here is that we want to identify the challenges so that we can work towards finding solutions. And the first one relates to uncertainty about climate change impacts and the transition to a lower carbon energy supply. So climate modeling is getting better and better, but still it's hard to downscale climate change to specific geographical areas. It's hard to answer the question, when, where, and how severe will climate impacts be? So that's on the physical risk side. And on the transition risk side, there are a lot of decision makers involved in energy and environmental policy. So that just makes the analysis a little bit more complicated. For example, if you're in the electric power sector and you're thinking about how much the sector is going to have to reduce emissions, what you need to know is, what is the transportation sector going to do? And that's also kind of, hard to gauge because there's so many players involved. And then on the technology side, it's always hard to anticipate how quickly technology will advance. So there's just a lot of uncertainty. And then the second bullet point is on timeframes, and we talked about this a little bit. So many investors might be looking out ahead at a 2 to 3 year period when they're deciding, whether to buy or sell securities. Now, is that the right time period to think about climate change impacts? The answer to that question might depend on what industry your company is in and how long your assets, what is the useful life of your assets. So, for example, if you have a power plant that will last 40 years, maybe you need to look out a little bit longer. However, the further companies look into the future, the greater the uncertainty. And companies in general do not like to report very speculative or uncertain information. But just to zoom out a little bit, if a lot of companies are focusing exclusively on the next few quarters or the next few years, then overall you have a greater risk of a tragedy of the horizon problem. And that phrase comes from a very influential speech by Mark Carney. He is the governor of the Bank of England and the chairman of the FSB. And his speech on the tragedy of the horizon was one of the driving factors behind this task force creation. So what the tragedy of the horizon refers to is a widespread short-term perspective that obscures systemic risks related to climate change. The third issue, we talked about this a little bit, is legal issues related to determining materiality. And as we know, financial filings are governed by securities laws, and materiality is defined by statute and by case law. And overall, companies are trying to minimize litigation risk related to financial filings. As we know, the U.S. is very litigious, and you want to avoid risks related to providing too little information, too much information, or confusing information. And one strategy companies could employ overall is to just try to limit the overall volume of financial disclosures to avoid inadvertent mistakes. Now, I just want to point out there are ongoing investigations and litigation in this area. So just to look at the example of Exxon very quickly, Exxon is currently being investigated by the state's attorney general in New York and Massachusetts to determine whether the company violated state laws by misleading investors on climate change. Separately, former and current employees are currently suing Exxon, alleging that misleading statements on the financial risk of climate change negatively impacted the value of company stock that they purchased through the company savings plan. A third example of a lawsuit is investors have a pending class action lawsuit against Exxon for misleading them on the financial impacts of climate change. And then fourth and finally, communities in California like San Francisco and Oakland are suing a number of oil and gas companies, including Exxon, for contributing to sea level rise while denying information about climate change. So what I wanted to point out with that example here is that the definition of materiality when it comes to climate change and financial filings may actually evolve as more investigations and litigation take place. So this is just something to keep your eye on. And then the fourth bullet here is about what is the right level of detail that should be included. So for example, what we've heard from ratings agencies is that the raw data on emissions and energy and water use, that may not be as helpful on its own as much as context about company strategy would be useful to know, how did they get to where they are today? What are their plans looking ahead? And a lot of that additional context often comes through in, for example, sustainability reports or on company websites. And that's a way to make this information more accessible and to provide a lot of context. So on this slide here, I have some more challenges that I just wanted to highlight for your attention. They are described in detail in the issue brief. So the first bullet here is about the differences in the quality and the precision of financial and sustainability data. So when we think of financial data, we think of income statements and balance sheets. These tend to be standardized and audited. When you look at sustainability data, data on emissions, energy use, water use, sometimes these are verified by third parties, but it is not required. And emissions data, when we're talking about Scope 1 emissions, that often is more precise than Scope 3, which has to do with emissions resulting from the supply chain. That tends to be involving more estimates. Similarly, if you're looking at data on waste management, that's usually much less precise than information about emissions. And then there are internal coordination challenges. So just to be really concrete, sometimes the time frames for preparing financial data and reviewing sustainability data are not very well aligned with each other. So if you're looking at your greenhouse gas emissions data for calendar year 2016, that might not be ready for publication on the same timeline as your company 10K filings. You may be working with different personnel. The securities compliance officers may not be well versed in climate risks, and then your sustainability officers may not be well integrated into that facility's operational risk management process. And the task force recognized that there are these internal coordination challenges, and what they said is, a great analogy can be drawn with cybersecurity, which is another evolving challenge that involves internal coordination and a new way of looking at things. So just as an example, when Target's data was breached, following that situation, there were investigations and litigation related to whether the board was exercising proper oversight over cybersecurity issues. So there are cross-cutting issues like climate change that are evolving in real time. Then we have heard from talking to companies that in general, working on climate reporting involves a lot of manpower and it's really complex. And part of the issue here is that we have a number of voluntary reporting frameworks that are very similar, but they're not identical. And so looking through a company's sustainability report, getting the right data, and then matching it up with the different questions in the different reporting frameworks, that can take a lot of time. And, one thing that hopefully the task force's recommendations will accomplish is mainstreaming reporting of this climate information. And as we discussed earlier, the goal of the task force originally had been to mainstream this data in financial reporting. And obviously, companies in different nations will have to look to securities laws. For companies in the U.S. who are working with U.S. legal definitions of materiality, maybe some of this information will be included in financial filings, maybe some of it will be in sustainability reports. But overall, we're trying to mainstream the reporting of this information. And I think this was mentioned earlier. If more companies are following the task force's recommendations and disclosing more consistent information, there's an opportunity for costs to be reduced related to shareholder proposals asking for more information on climate change. And then the last bullet on this slide relates to perceptions of the usefulness of scenario analysis and the financial disclosure of metrics and targets. So when the task force had its draft recommendations out for review, they allowed a period of public comment, and they summarized that public comment in a publication, and we've excerpted from that in our issue brief. And it was really interesting to see the divide between financial and non-financial companies on scenario analysis and metrics and targets. So 3/4 of financial companies found both of these, scenario analysis and the illustrative examples of metrics and targets, to be helpful, whereas less than 1/4 of non-financial companies agreed on scenario analysis, and about 1/3 agreed on metrics and targets. And in both cases, NGOs share the same perspective as financial companies, which suggests that the pressure on non-financial companies to conduct this analysis and to share metrics and targets is likely to persist. So that was kind of an overview of what we determined to be the opportunities and challenges related to climate reporting. And overall, here are our four key findings. We believe that the task force recommendations strike a good balance between the need for greater transparency for stakeholders and investors and the need for companies to have some flexibility. As we discussed earlier, we have those four categories: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets that apply across the board to all organizations. And then there is that implementing guidance for the financial sector and those key non-financial groups: energy, transportation, materials and buildings, and agriculture, food, and forest products. Our second finding is that we believe that even in the absence of action by federal regulators, companies are likely to expand and enhance their climate-related disclosures. And we think that's going to be the case because of investor pressure, like we mentioned earlier, as well as action by states and European policy. So there are a couple of EU directives requiring reporting of energy and water use and greenhouse gas emissions and climate risks. Also, France has a new law called Article 173 of the French law on energy transition for green growth, and that actually has additional requirements for climate-related financial disclosures. And as we have discussed on this webinar, we do think that greater transparency will have several benefits, and we did describe these earlier, but we're talking about improved corporate governance, improved internal communication, reduced costs related to shareholder proposals, and of course, as there is more transparency, investors can help smooth that transition to a lower carbon economy. Finally, we think it's clear, and hopefully you guys have picked up on this, there's a lot more work that needs to be done to help companies implement these recommendations, particularly around scenario analysis. So what we're hearing from companies is that they would like to conduct this analysis in-house, and they're trying to figure out how do you determine what is the right information level to share. They don't want to disclose more than their industry peers, but they also want to keep up with their industry peers. And we think that more collaboration is needed between investors and companies around what exactly will be useful from these scenario analysis. And a lot of this work will take the form of sector-specific workshops because a lot of this analysis will just depend on what type of business your company focuses on. So with that overview, I wanted to turn to our discussion, and we're going to start with some of these questions that are on the slide. And then after that, feel free to just continue typing in your questions, and I'll read them to our panelists. So the first one, I just wanted to kind of zoom out and ask, in your view, what do you feel are the greatest strengths of these new task force recommendations? And I'll open that up to both Matt and Neil.
I guess to me the greatest strength is a consensus around a framework. Prior to that, there were recommendations on financial disclosures, but I think the fact we went through with so many stakeholders, different kinds of stakeholders, an intensive debate, and reached this framework of financial disclosures for all sectors, I think that's a tremendously powerful strength moving forward.
I would add just simply whose framework this is. This is actually not the task force's framework. The task force was asked by the Financial Stability Board, which again is the G20 financial regulators, to do this. So this is financial regulators. It's their framework. That's very different from anything we've ever had before.
Yes, that's a really good point. It does show that more folks are focusing on this issue. The next question, just generally, could you talk a little bit about how the task force came to focus on scenario analysis as a tool that most companies should use? How did that come to be one of the key features of this set of recommendations?
I think there was this, what are you disclosing against? what do you expect the world is going to look like, and how do those changes in the world change your company? So there was a real sense that you need external context against which to project financial risk. And so then the question is, what should that context be? The climate world does temperature-based scenarios. That's kind of what the climate world does. There was a bit of debate about that, about whether temperature-based scenarios is the best way to go as opposed to an event-based scenario or a shorter time frame type scenarios I discussed earlier. But I think it's really the consensus that you need an external driver.
I would just add, if you look at the universe of companies, the vast majority of them are not doing any reporting at all. And the argument against reporting is uncertainty. And in business, really one of the best ways to deal with uncertainty is scenario analysis. So it felt like a very logical way to help companies using tools they're already familiar with to deal with the uncertainty of price on carbon, regulation, flooding of facilities, whatever. So it felt like a way to help companies deal with financial uncertainty in the midst of uncertain trends. And so it felt to us, I think, to be a very logical way to deal with this.
I would say, though, there is some criticism about this, that it's sort of too high a bar, because the goal, there was a less is more constituency on the task force that said, let's just get people reporting, and asking them to develop scenarios that's a lot of work. So this was not a slam dunk, I would say.
Okay, and maybe that kind of leads us into our third question here. What are some areas where further work is needed to help companies implement the recommendations?
I guess to me, we really need to see prototypes and to see how different the range of companies that could be reporting or will be reporting is huge. The range of types of companies, the range of approaches. So I think the most important thing at this point is to see some early prototypes. No one approach is right, no one approach is wrong, but I think we need to see how different companies are dealing with making disclosures under uncertainty, especially in this area of scenarios. And just to clarify, that I wasn't necessarily saying it had to be always or at first a quantitative approach, a detailed quantitative approach. But over time, and again, you're looking at a long-term implementation, if you're in a country with very low carbon price today, you could have companies just saying, we will not report because the carbon price is $3, and not look at scenarios. We think it's important that this area of scenarios be fleshed out, and I would say into prototypes, giving, showing a way forward for other companies within sectors.
My observation on this one would be patience. Let companies internalize this and get moving on their own. I know there was broad apprehension that this whole thing could become just a huge bonanza for consultants, because the bandwidth within companies is not necessarily always there to be able to do this cogently. So I think this is going to take a while. I know that we have a whole team available to work on this, and they are working on this. And even then, it's taking a long time to sort of figure out what the best approach is for a large, complicated portfolio.
Okay, great. And could you tell us a little bit about what you're hearing from investors about the task force's recommendations?
Very little.
I would agree with that.
We've heard from one or two socially responsible investors that tend to talk about social and environmental issues. But I also caveat that we do a formally structured fall roadshow to our investors. And so really, this answer to your question, Fatima, is incomplete. I'll know more by Christmas.
Okay, great. That's great. So let's go ahead and jump into some of the audience questions. So we had one in particular about one of the metrics and targets. And the question is, do you think that increasing the use of corporate carbon pricing would be a good indicator to stakeholders and investors that companies are managing their climate-related risks?
Well, I'll give my view. I don't think of it as an indicator of that. I think if a company has a strategy for where they're trying to move their portfolio of investments, for where they want to be in 10 years, and they choose to facilitate that with internal carbon pricing, then super. But just having internal carbon pricing without a real strategy wouldn't indicate to me that they're managing carbon better than another company. It's that link to a strategy they're trying to advance their company with and toward.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I think the thoughtless implementation of carbon pricing is not useful. And if the notion is that, well, we did carbon pricing, so we're in the game, I agree. It's not really necessarily an indicator of that.
Okay, great. We had another audience question about which G20 governments have endorsed the task force recommendations. So maybe we can broaden that out a little bit and just talk about your perceptions on the reception that the task force recommendations received from the G20 finance ministers and the FSB.
I actually have to pass on that one. I honestly don't know the answer.
Yeah, I don't either. I think, though, that the general reception I hear is very favorable around the framework, and that various stakeholders, including the governments, are looking forward to seeing these early prototypes. And there's excitement about having a standardized or common framework, but I don't know which governments or others have fully endorsed it, et cetera.
Yeah, it does seem like, sort of similar to the focus on, what are investors saying about the recommendations. We're in very early days, so a lot of this will continue to unfold over the next few months. We had another audience question, which was, how do we avoid a situation where only those companies that are best equipped to address climate change are disclosing climate risks and opportunities, while those that are least able to adapt are just avoiding disclosure?
Well, I guess in general, you have both, if you have regulatory trends that occur towards disclosure, that will solve potentially some of that. But I think beyond that, you also have markets. And if you're out borrowing money to do projects, and if you don't have good strategy in the judgment of the lenders or the investors, and you have to pay higher interest rates or not have as much valuation in your stock, over time that will become a great equalizer, maybe even greater than regulation. But I think it'll work in tandem. Regulation will increase for disclosure, but I do think many of these companies that guide investments or make investments or manage assets or insure or loan are expecting improved and more clearly stated climate strategies at companies.
Yeah, I think investors do become a huge driver of this and have become so. I think the 2017 proxy season will be very interesting to watch to see how many climate disclosure shareholder proposals arrive, and I think you'll also see more disclosure just simply in the anticipation of that phenomenon. So, and that will be true of both, solution providers as well as others. So, I actually would not look, particularly in the U.S., to regulation. I would look to investors as the near-term driver.
Yeah, I think that's right. And actually, the task force, when it released the draft recommendations, they had a public consultation period. And one of the survey questions was, which of the following factors would encourage you to implement the task force's recommendations? And what they found was that companies, the top factor that would drive them to adopt the recommendations was requests from investors. And for investors, what would drive them to use the task force recommendations was adoption by peers. And so it does seem to be that as more attention is focused on climate reporting and you see more and more investors picking this up, that is probably what will drive those reporting laggards to enhance their disclosure. Here's a really kind of central question. Somebody asked, this is basically risk mitigation, right, for climate change. So there's other issues like population changes, water scarcity, materials. What is the reason to have a focus on climate change as opposed to just a general focus on risk mitigation? So this question is really about, what is special about climate change that requires this comprehensive approach?
I think that's a great question. We had that question internally. Why not cyber risk? Why not earthquake risk? Why not non-climate related natural disasters, pandemics? This is a common risk across many, many industries and geographies. So in that sense, it's a global risk. I also think that the way we went about developing the framework, it's accommodating of other risks, but we're very much, when we think about risk here, to us, we think about ESG risk, of which climate is a large E type risk. And so we will do a climate report, but we also do an ESG report. And they're equally as important. But I think that's a great question.
Yeah, and I think you have to step back and just, again, think about the fact this happened largely because of the Paris Agreement, the fact that you had the world's governments, by and large, coming together, and the business sector saying we need to do something about this. So I think if we had tried, if there had been an attempt to make it broader, it probably wouldn't have happened. But the fact you had the momentum of Paris behind it and the leadership of Carney and Bloomberg behind it facilitated it happening. I do think it is a leverageable model that could be used for other things, but if you want it to be used for other kinds of risks and opportunities, we got to make this work.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. And I'm kind of reminded of Mark Carney's speech that kind of was one of the driving factors behind the creation of the task force, which was really focusing on that tragedy of the horizon problem where climate change is an issue where the emissions that we have already emitted will have long-term consequences. So there's something about the mismatch between cause and effect that I think makes this more of a cutting issue that does require some special attention. That's just my own personal thought on that. Let's see, we have a couple more questions here. Maybe this came up in task force conversations, but when you're looking at climate change impacts, physical risks like sea level rise, how would you deal with the fact that different companies might assume different probabilities for these kinds of impacts? You know, I suppose that's up to the investors to evaluate the quality of these analytical analyses of climate change impacts. But the question is basically, you know, for things like sea level rise, what do you do when different organizations are going to have different probabilities for these impacts?
Well, I think that this framework leads to disclosure that companies are making those judgments and assessments. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're disclosing all of their assumptions. So I think we need to be careful if listeners to this call are thinking they will get every last detail of scenarios that have been analyzed, et cetera. They may not, because the more critical they are to the company, the more it becomes critical business information. Now, having said that, what I am saying is it's very important. Let's say you have assets at sea level. Say you're a hotel firm, and you have beautiful hotel assets 5 to 10 foot above sea level all over the world. I think most investors would expect that they are looking at sea level rise, changes in storm patterns, etc. But rather than checking their assumptions, I think assessing their strategies for dealing with it, including changes of business model, risk mitigation, etc., that's what they should expect to see versus the actual technical detail of what their assumptions are.
Yeah, it's funny. We were bouncing around some event-based scenario ideas, and one of them was let's consider 2 once-in-500-year storms in markets where we have a heavy retail presence. And then Harvey and Irma arrived, and we got it. It just happened. So we're actually having a living scenario. I think as companies get moving on this, hopefully they'll disclose their assumptions. And so you'd be able to even out. If one company thought it was a 5-foot sea level rise and another company thought it was a 1.5 foot, that you'd know that.
Okay, great. And now we have a question about how the task force recommendations fit in with the other voluntary reporting frameworks like CDP and GRI. So the question is, are these task force recommendations going to replace CDP? And if companies have already learned the CDP format, does that mean they have to relearn another disclosure process? And so, you know, if you could kind of clarify how these different frameworks fit together, that would be great.
My sense is that CDP and the TCFD are going to harmonize. I think, and I can't speak for CDP, but I'm pretty sure that they've got a draft 2018 template that is derivative of the TCFD guidelines. I cannot speak to GRI or SASB or any of the other ones.
This is my view on the whole thing. I think that there'll be a harmonization so that all of these different approaches shake hands at key junctures. But I can't imagine that we would do carbon disclosures in our financial reporting at the same level of detail we currently do in CDP or GRI. And it's more a matter of just volume. For a company like mine, we're in 100 pages in some of these disclosures. We're not going to have a carbon disclosure that large, so it becomes more of in a financial report. So it becomes more of a summary. But I believe that there still will be a need for more detailed reporting with assumptions, with more granularity in some of these other reports that we currently use. Most companies do, we do. So I think having them shake hands and operate together is the key thing. But in financial, I think it'll be more summary oriented. It'll be pithy and will be very clear that all of these different points were touched and analyzed, and here are the conclusions. But if you want more detail, you may go to one of these other reports for the detail. That's my opinion on where we'll end up.
Okay. Turning to another topic, I'd be curious in hearing your perspective on the challenges related to transatlantic collaboration on climate reporting. So are there challenges related to working in different legal systems on this topic?
Yes. I think the U.S. context is pretty litigious, and so it's risky to disclose. As you pointed out earlier, it's risky not to disclose, but my sense is the discussion was weighted around it's riskier to disclose. You yourself cited the data around less than a quarter of preparers and more than 3/4 of investors. So I think that's a natural tension. I think there's an easier relationship with information in most European countries. You pointed out Rule 173. There's already a law that French financial institutions disclose. So, yeah, that is a tension that will not go away anytime soon.
Great. Okay. Well, I think we've had a pretty robust discussion here, and I just wanted to offer up the opportunity to provide any closing remarks. If maybe Neil, if you want to kick us off.
Well, I want to thank the people who called in, and I invite everyone to continue to be part of the dialogue. We're all stakeholders in different ways. We're early in this curve of implementation, so I think the more we talk, the more we see, the better prototypes we get to early, and see some really strong decision making built around climate over time early in this period. I think it could really help accelerate the progress. So thanks to everybody who cares about this, and good luck in implementing it, and I look forward to staying in touch with people.
And I would echo those thanks and engagement, and just offer up, if you're a bank or an asset manager and you're getting into this flow, give JPMorgan Chase a call. We've got a team deployed and working on it, and we're learning a lot, and we would love to share our learning and also hear from you on yours. Also, get in touch with the Secretariat. They are very eager to facilitate and promote adoption, and there may be resources or opportunities or events, discussions that you could engage with. But thank you, C2ES, for organizing the discussion, and thank you, Fatima, for your terrific facilitation.
Yeah, thank you both for making the time to be here. I'm really happy that we were able to share your expertise with our audience. I definitely think that there is room for continued conversation on this topic, so if folks who are dialed in now are interested, we can definitely schedule a follow-up webinar in about 6 months and sort of hear how implementation is going. And definitely check out our c2es.org website for this publication and for other resources on business resilience to climate change. And thanks everyone for dialing in.